Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you. Welcome to Main Street Books in our virtual gathering space. I'm Beth Helfrich. I'm the events manager at Main Street Books. And on behalf of Ada and the rest of the staff, it's our privilege to welcome you here today, especially on such a beautiful, sunny spring afternoon. We're grateful that you've carved out some time to spend with us. We're here to celebrate the recent release of the Oak Papers by Dr. James Canton, who is here with us this afternoon. And we're really excited to do this in partnership with our good friends at the Davidson Lands Conservancy, who have gratefully joined us this afternoon and have generously provided us with our capable moderator. And it's my pleasure to introduce him to you all. John Griffith is here with us. Hi, John.
Hey there.
He is a retired college president and Presbyterian minister who started his career as a vice president right here at Davidson College, overseeing admissions and fundraising. He's an avid swimmer, walker, and artist, a very talented artist, working to capture the beauty of the natural world. John and his wife, Nancy, returned to Davidson in their retirement, and he recently joined the board of directors of the Davidson Lands Conservancy to assist in expanding the financial resources available to support its mission. I know they are so glad to have him on board, as are we this afternoon. So, John, I'm going to allow you to introduce our featured guests.
Thank you, Beth. It's an honor for the Davidson Lands Conservancy to co-sponsor today's program with Main Street Books as we work to conserve the creations of nature that surround us in this community that is being engulfed by the expansion of the metropolitan area. In this effort, we stand on 4 pillars. Those pillars make a huge difference for us: land conservation and stewardship, urban forestry, greenways and trails, and wildlife corridors. As Beth indicated, joining me in this program are our distinguished experts, James Canton and Chow. Dr. Canton is a senior lecturer and renowned writer in the arena of creative nonfiction. He teaches in the MA program in wild writing. I want to know what that is. Wild writing at the University of Essex, from where he received his PhD. The MA program, as far as I could figure out, explores the ties between literature and landscape in East Anglia. His writings include From Cairo to Baghdad, 2011, Out of Essex, Reimagining a Literary Landscape, 2013, Ancient Wanderings, Journeys into Prehistoric Britain, 2017, and the book we're exploring today, The Oak Papers, issued in Great Britain in 2020 and last month in the United States. I encourage you to go online, University of Essex, and explore this man's amazing career. And you'll also see what's exploding right now. It's what we're doing. Engaging people who are wanting to understand what surrounds them, the beauty of nature, and how to effectively engage it now. Chow is a Davidson College student from Durham, North Carolina, who is exploring environmental and educational studies. He told me he got the start in this arena through 9 years of scouting, and in particular, his Eagle Scout project. Chris is on the swimming and diving teams. And in the summer of 2020, he served as a sustainability scholar working with Trees Charlotte on restarting the Mecklenburg County Treasure Tree Program to document large and historically significant trees in the city. We've engaged him now in Davidson to the Davidson Lands Conservancy to develop our treasure tree program that will be launched this spring. And he tells us that pictures will be taken of every one of those with homeowners, citizens, and students. Chris told me he intends to pursue an MA, and I believe also a PhD. So let's get started. James, I am fascinated by how you shared in almost a diary format your amazing encounter with the 800-year-old honeywood oak. What do you want us to understand about why you did this and what you learned?
Well, thanks, John. Thanks for that introduction. It was very, very kind of you. Yeah, that's right. I mean, the Oak Papers began quite a few years ago now, with the simple objective of wanting to go and sit and observe in the old ways that that the great naturalists have over the years, right back from Gilbert White in Britain, who's kind of seen as our kind of great grandfather figure of nature writing. Just to go and sit by an 800-year-old oak tree and observe. And that was the kind of the rationale initially of the project. I was teaching at the time in a secondary school, in a middle school, as you call it, just down the road from the Honeywood Oak. And so it made a lot of sense for me just to step into this beautiful small English country estate and just spend time with this ancient tree. So that was the original thinking. I'd already started teaching the MA in wild writing at that stage. So I was teaching one day a week at the University of Essex. And one of the things I was really conscious of was trying to build my skills as a naturalist. I'm very much an amateur naturalist. So I know a bit about birds, but I didn't know much about insects. And I just thought this would be a really nice way of me kind of extending my knowledge of the kind of the ecosystem of the oak tree. So this was the initial thinking. And I was thinking, well, it might be, it might make a really nice book to just be writing about, almost like a biography of an oak tree as much as anything. I mean, it's a pretty amazing tree. It's seen sort of 30 generations of humans come and go in its lifetime. One of the things that I knew about this tree before I'd been there is that we have documented evidence of its presence during the English Civil War. So in the 17th century, 1640s, we've got evidence of parliamentarian troops meeting at the Marks Hall estate, as it was then known as the Honeywood Oaks, and it was owned by a leader called Thomas Honeywood. And we know that the troops met there before they went to the siege of Colchester. So even then, 400 years ago, would still have been a sizable oak in itself then. So these were my initial thoughts, and I thought, well, I could get this across perhaps in diary format, and that sort of became the first version of the Oak Papers. And then I realized very, very, very soon that there were so many more stories that linked both this ancient tree with the humans that had kind of coexisted around it over the centuries, but also that I needed to kind of layer the text, the narrative, with the voices of so many more humans, both present today, so kind of woodmen and woodwomen that I met, and environmental psychologists who would kind of give me further kind of insights, but also through the centuries. So I went back and did the kind of the hard graft of going to research facilities like the British Library and looking at this relationship that humans have had with oak trees. So, there was a kind of wider sense of wanting to both educate myself and then turn that into a book that would be valuable to kind of educate others on this incredible relationship between oaks and humans that's existed right back into prehistory.
One of the things that kind of amazed me was exactly that, how you took us back in history, but you also kept us now here in our own communities.
Sure.
And there were several phrases and definitions that I found fascinating. The one was the word pagan, which comes from the Latin pagus, which simply means people that lived in the countryside, as opposed to the image that we grew up with of the pagans.
Yeah.
The other thing was the word druid, where dru means oak, and wid, as you pointed out, means to know or to see. And what that did to me, it sort of opened the whole Pandora's box of spirituality and knowing beyond oneself.
Sure.
So can you talk a little bit about that whole universe? And maybe it's personal, but it may be a lot more than that you would like to share. And maybe there's something you'd like to read on that for us. Yeah,
sure, John. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think you've nicely illustrated the process that I kind of went on. Essentially, it was a kind of educating myself. I didn't know this when I began the project. But as you say, I spent a lot of time in research libraries and realized things like this, that the word pagan is straight from the Latin pagus, which means of the countryside. So the connotations that we add to it have been, later. And of course, that's the contrast to the Roman notion of civilized, which we've taken on as well, which simply means people who live in the cities. Now, you have to remember that in Britain, and certainly, across North America, up until fairly recently, people just didn't live in cities. The cities weren't a thing. So in Britain, it was only the Romans arriving that created the first city at Colchester down the road. So again, we have to be careful with the connotations we have with words. And we have to recognize as we go back into history that you don't necessarily need to have these associations, either with the idea of being civilized if you live in a city, or that you're some sort of pagan, crazed person or something, just by simply living in the countryside. So these were important points. And partly when you do your reading of some of the earlier texts that mention oaks, you get this sense of the complexity of the relationship between humans and oaks. So if you look back on a writer like Pliny the Elder, who's often quoted, and it's from Pliny that you get this idea of the Druid having oak knowledge, and that within Britain, the wise people were the Druids. The Druids were both men and women who were very, very much kind of revered as the spiritual leaders, if you like, the cultural leaders. And when the Romans arrived in Britain, one of the things that they realized they needed to do was gain control over the Druids. And as we say, the Druids had this oak knowledge. Literally, that's what their name meant. And in Pliny, what you see is whether it's elaborated or, that's difficult to say, but his depiction of the Druids is fascinating. And this is where we get some of our images even today. So he writes about how the chief Druids would at particular times would cut down the mistletoe from the oak. So the most sacred mistletoe was that grew in the oak. And they would wear all white robes, according to Pliny, and they would cut the mistletoe down with a golden sickle, and the mistletoe they would collect on white sheets. So again, we started to have this powerful imagery of the pre-Roman figures in Britain and their association with the oak trees. And then in my reading, what I realized that you could go further and further back into prehistory, and even right back to the kind of the earliest farmers, that kind of first Neolithic phase, where people are starting to move from the Mesolithic, from hunter-gatherers, that even then at that point, oaks were absolutely vital, because what oaks provided was they guaranteed a food source. So you were guaranteed acorns as a as something you could look back, you could rely on, even if your crops failed, you still had the acorns that you could make bread from and that you could feed as pannage to your animals. And this is, you know, there's fantastic kind of huge pits that have been discovered that date exactly from this period, where you have all these prepared acorns that have been sliced and been cleaned of their tannin, ready to be fed if needed during these kind of terrible kind of years for the early farmers. So this was all very much informed my my knowledge as I went on and as I started to kind of gain my own oak knowledge, if you like. But yeah, I mean, maybe that's the best way in, John, is maybe a short reading will give everyone who's kindly gathered on your nice sunny Sunday afternoons. It's not quite so sunny here. It's dark here, so I'm sort of snuggled down a bit more. But yeah, if you'd like to pretend it's a nice warm evening and you want to snuggle, I'll just give you a little reading, which will give you a little flavour of the oak papers. Okay. Wherever oak trees grow around the globe, people have developed a connection to them. Throughout human history, particular oaks have been favoured for their setting, for their age and size. Ancient oaks have always been special. People collect beneath their boughs. They may gather there as a place of significance within the landscape, or merely as somewhere to shelter. Whereas we humans are creatures of movement, oaks are static beings. They do not shift. They are born and they die on the same patch of earth. It is that sure-footedness that is so appealing. Ancient oaks hold a powerful sense of longevity, the sense of security, the sense of attachment to a place across time enchants us. We are drawn to old oaks. You can stand beneath a grand oak and know that your more distant ancestors did so too. Oaks hold on to the memories of earlier generations. By touching the skin of the oak, it is possible to feel some tentative trace of those that have gone before. Human beings and oaks have lived beside one another as neighbours since the earliest times, and we continue to do so. We no longer need the bodies of oak trees to build our houses or to fuel our fires, and we no longer need acorns to sustain us through hard years and meagre harvests. Yet on some level, we still lean on oak trees in ways we do not fully understand. We need them.
Wow. You know, I want to direct a question to Chris, but before doing that, I want to encourage people to use the chat to put in comments and questions that we'll come to as we wrap up. I've got to admit something. When I read this now about a month ago, most people that live where I do know that I walk 3 or 4 miles a day. And all of a sudden I started looking at trees. And I found one that I go up and touch. So I'd like to ask Chris, given what James is sharing with us, and we're going to get into this deeper, I'm sure, what would you, Chris, like us to know about trees here in our community?
Well, thank you for the introduction. And kind of continuing on from Dr. Canton's passage about kind of connections with oaks is my own experience with a bur oak. So this bur oak sits on Sunset Road, which is around exit 16 off of I-77. And it was planted in 1939 for utility purposes. So the only reason it was planted was by this farmer to provide shade for a watering trough for his cattle and hogs. And it was planted kind of back when that whole area was just kind of small family farms. And anyone who's familiar with the area now knows that it's kind of it's like strip mall after strip mall and being really quickly developed as all those farms are bought up and, you know, turned into housing plots and things like that. And so in 1995, this tree was on one of those small farms that was bought by a developer. And the developer was opening a chain of fast food restaurants. So there's 4 or 5 of them on the old farm. And I find it just really charming that the developer listened to the kind of community outcry, because by 1995, this was declared a Mecklenburg County treasure tree and actually set aside about an acre for it to be protected. And so, you know, unlike so many trees in our Charlotte area, this was able to still remain standing, and actually is still standing today. And I just love it because there's really no practical reason for it to be saved in terms of developers' eyes, and it was. And, you know, every time I go into the Charlotte area, I always make an effort to stop for a few moments, you know, right by it, because it's right next to the parking lot of one of those restaurants. And I love the connection between the natural world, and as it just sits like probably, you know, 100 yards from a brick and mortar chain. And it challenges the historic notion of environmentalism as this kind of notion that the environment is in like natural parks or state parks. And it kind of challenges that by saying that, you know, the environment is really all around us. And urban forestry is definitely an emerging, you know, thing. And especially in the Charlotte area as it's developing so quickly. And I just really love that it's a reminder that, you know, while things change around us, the continuity of nature is always going to be there, and will always kind of be undeterred by our development, even as it changes. And it's always a nice kind of experience to take a couple minutes when I'm driving into Charlotte, usually going to a restaurant or picking something up from like a store down there, to stop for a few minutes and take a kind of just like sit on top of the hood of the car and just kind of sit underneath it. And it's almost religious in that respect, because it's like a sanctuary, and it sits right on Sunset Road, which is probably one of the busiest roads in the Charlotte area. And I think when you're sitting underneath it, you're so captivated by the tree's scale and beauty that the road is almost like silent, even though you're right next to it. And that's an experience that I have never really had with the tree before, and one that I really value closely with this one.
Wow. I want to come back in a minute to what you're actually doing in the town of Davidson, but you teed up something in my mind that I'd like to direct to James. In both your personal journey while sitting with honeywood and other oaks, and in the insights you shared from a painter, a woodworker, a psychologist, and a naturalist, you transmit to us a sense of peace and calm. It's what Chris just said about sitting on the hood of his car under the tree. That sense of peace and calm that comes from being with nature, and in particular oaks. Now this may be more personal than you want to get, but I'm wondering if you would take us inside that reality for you, and perhaps for us, because the oak papers, you're in those trees a lot.
Yeah, that's nicely put. I think Chris put it so well. I mean, the thing that I try and make sure that everyone learns on day one of the MA Wild Writing is that we are of nature. We are part of nature. There is no distinction. There's the natural world, and then there's us. We're part of it. We may have spent the last couple of 100 years or something building these buildings and stuff that make us feel that we're not, but we are of nature. And that's one of the kind of core aspects that I think is so vital, both within, you know, kind of books like this, the Oak Papers, teaching the wild writing, and any sense of dealing with climate change, climate emergency, whatever you want to call it. We need to recognize we're part of the natural world. We're just a little bit of it. We're just a different species. It's pretty affecting species. But I think this is very interesting, because when you speak to, so one of the people I spoke to, as John's reference was an environmental psychologist, and he told me about, you know, a really famous study that was conducted not that long ago, about 20 years ago at Edinburgh University, where they just took students, and they put EEG monitors on their heads, and then they got them just to walk around the city, and then checked out what happened to their brain waves, what happened to their brain patterns when they went from urban into parkland, as they called it, areas. And what happened was that these students, and it can be replicated with anyone, is that you go into what the psychologists call meditative states. When you go into green spaces, you go from what's called stressed states into meditative states. Now, this is exactly the experience that Chris has narrated of going and sitting next to that oak tree. It's the exact same experience that we all can relate to, of going to woodland and feeling peace and calm, relaxed, you know. And this again, it's like such a basic part, but we need reminding of this occasionally, because we've become urbanized as a species, and that's the simple truth. And we forget this thing, that if we want to feel better, just go to a park, go to a green space, go to a favorite oak tree. You know, this was in the book, when I interviewed a colleague of mine about this, he said, well, look, this is all part of what you're experiencing. When you go to your 800-year-old oak tree, you know, even before you go, you get calmer, because you know when you're there, you'll feel all relaxed. So you get this kind of extra hit before you're even there. So I thought this was absolutely fascinating, that the scientists can see this perfectly simply just by putting the EEG on. But it's something, you know, we've lived on this planet for many, many thousands of years in kind of non-urban spaces. And our natural sense is to be in natural spaces. Now, once we remove ourselves from that, unfortunately, what happens is we have to make sure we keep going back into it, or else we do get stressed out. And this was sort of, again, part of the journey that I realized that I went on was realizing things like this. And the 800-year-old oak tree was just a kind of, maybe it was just kind of a reminder, because as soon as I went and sat next to this tree, I just thought, well, this is gorgeous. This is a really nice way to spend my time. Why don't I do this all the time? Why don't I do this every day? And then I kind of was able to do that a lot more, because I made it a project. This was my project. So yeah, and I mean, Chris was just narrating it absolutely perfectly there, you know, and I think we could probably share that experience, that we've all probably got sort of favorite trees or favorite bits of parkland that we go to when we can. And then I guess the skill is to ensure that we build that into our daily lives, that is an absolute core to our being, to our existence.
You know, something that you did that I found very effective, in addition to the sense of the tree, is the amazing birds and bugs and bees and fungi and everything that, as a result of the amount of time you spent with it, it was like there was a whole world that you grabbed a hold of. Can you talk about that, or maybe read about that, or what would you say to us about that?
Yeah,
revelation?
sure. I mean, the thing is that on a kind of on a simple basis, the oak tree is an incredible tree for acting as a host to a huge amount of other living things. And as I say, when I initially started up, this was very much kind of part of what I wanted to do, was to learn about you know, some of those incredible insects that live only in what's known as the heart rot the kind of central core of an ancient oak tree that rots away and turns into this kind of sort of red powdery kind of substance, which is literally the inner of the tree rotting away. And you only get this after a tree is sort of 400 years old. So those creatures need a pretty specific site. And this kind of, I found absolutely fascinating. At one point I was pretty sure that I was able to recognize what was, I think was a forest stiletto fly on me when I was sitting on this bench next to this 800-year-old tree. And they only live in the heart rot of an ancient oak tree. So you start to realize quite quickly, well, if you chop that tree down, because, we're really sorry, it's in the way, we need to do development. We'll plant loads of other trees. We'll plant like 300 trees down the road in that spare lot we've got. It doesn't count. It doesn't do it, because that stiletto fly and lots of other creatures need the specifics of that ancient oak tree, and that's, again, if you speak to the naturalists, they know this already, but I'm not a naturalist. My training is from literature. If I'm anything, I'm a travel writing specialist. So for me, this was a really big kind of game changer, because I then understood why we can't just do this thing where we kind of, knock down bits of ancient woodland, which we do in Britain quite a lot at the moment, and sort of developers then allow developers to say, well, look, we've planted a whole new, kind of woodland for you, because it doesn't impact the creatures. So this was something I learned fairly early on by speaking to the naturalists, and I recognized it, and I recognized it. I mean, as you say, I just had this a kind of fairly wonderful experience of sitting by an oak tree and watching as barn owls flew past, as tree creepers kind of made their nests in the bark, so it was just a gorgeous thing. I was very fortunate to be kind of winched up into the tree at one point, I got to, it was kind of, I'm not great. I'm not one of these kind of people that will just kind of climb up all the limbs. And there was a health and safety issue as well, because it was in a country estate, and I had to be looked after by an arboriculturalist. But I went up into this tree, and it was amazing. It was just fantastic to be kind of, 30, 40 foot up and just tucked away there. And the guy who I was with, he was like, hey, do you want to go right up to the top? I was like, no, I'm fine here. Can we just like go quiet for the next couple of hours? So I let him kind of go clambering up to wherever he wanted, and I could just observe. And that was what I wanted to be doing. So, you can learn so much from just settling down in one place and then observing this ecosystem. I mean, the guy that I met, who was my kind of guide to the Honeywood Oak, he had the title of Curator of Trees on the Marks Hall estate where this oak is. And he described it, I think he described it so well. This is a guy, Jonathan Jukes, and he talked about an oak tree and an old oak tree being like a block of flats. And there are so many inhabitants in this block of flats, so many different, an absolute kind of wonderful kind of community that all kind of live within this one building, if you like. And that's a really nice analogy, I think.
Chris, I want to pull you in on this. One of the things that James said is about developers stripping the land and building new developments and sticking trees in. It seems like every day I travel out in our town and there's another strip that's occurred and more development happening. I think it would help us all if you told us how Treasure Trees, how that program works, what's involved with it, so that as we're continue to engage James on this, people can start thinking about it in relation to this community? How does the Treasure Tree program work?
Yeah, of course. So our Treasure Tree program is going to outline the most notable trees around town. So that includes, large specimens, rare trees, and trees that are historically significant to the town. And that includes like family history as well. And so I think what we really wanted to do with our program is kind of include this whole kind of, family history aspect to it, that and kind of draw in the town into our program rather than just kind of noting strictly large trees, which a lot of other champion tree programs do. And so like, that's why one of our main goals is to have every tree photographed with a homeowner, a citizen, or students, because, when the town feels a personal connection to this program, and inevitably the trees that are in this program, conservation attitudes in the town are gonna, be positively affected by that. And that's one of our core goals with this, also to keep it going after my time here, is that almost every champion tree program around, the whole nation kind of fizzles out after a couple of years, because there's only so much that people are interested in reading about in terms of large trees, particularly people who don't have a forestry background or environmental studies. And so we want our program to be kind of longer lasting and to be really a snapshot of the town's history and how important it is for, to document that. And I think that's why we want ours to be kind of focused on the people almost as much as it is about the trees themselves, which is why every tree gets like a whole history write-up that I can find by pulling county records, by interviewing people that, kind of give us that whole perspective that you might not see when you're just kind of driving by and looking at it.
And that also means that the affiliation with Davidson Lands Conservancy gives it some continuity beyond your leadership and involvement. It's my understanding that every tree is going to be labeled. Is that correct?
Yes. So we actually just ordered these, which is exciting, but every tree is going to have a 4x4 metal diamond that will also have a number stamped onto it, as well as a QR code, which you just point your phone camera at it and it'll take you to our homepage for our website. And by doing that, it makes our program really accessible to people. And that's one of the main things we want. And everything on that website will kind of give you the whole background of the tree. You'll have the chance to see the pictures, especially with the homeowners and the students, which is a big deal for us. And yeah, accessibility is a huge component of our program that we really want to be inclusive of everybody and also make everyone kind of, as they're interested, kind of be able to access everything.
James, as you hear this and you think about your community and your natural world and your urban areas, are there any insights or advice that you would give us from your experience?
Well, first of all, that it just sounds like a really good program. So well done to Chris and for everyone for kind of initiating this and keeping it running. I think that idea that Chris is getting across there about kind of naming trees. I mean, I think obviously on one level, I'm kind of like, yeah, we're bringing them into a kind of human context, but I think maybe that we need to do that. As humans, we like doing that. We do that to animals that we call our pets. We give them names and then we look after them, and we recognize their individual traits as well, which is an interesting aspect. And I think if we can start doing this with trees as well, brilliant. I mean, fantastic. I mean, I think one of the things we've learned in Britain, I think recently is I think more and more people have recognized, particularly during the pandemic, the importance of the natural world, as we've said, of our connection with it, of our need to be a part of it for our own well-being, for our own mental health. And this is then interesting, that the idea of kind of connecting up with certain trees is sort of part of that whole pattern, part of that program. I saw in the chat that Frances was saying about her favorite tree is the angel oak, which is just, I've seen so many stunning photos of this tree. And one day I'd love to come and have a look at that. But I mean, this is the thing that, there are wonderful trees out there. And one of the things that I think one of the big revelations that I had while researching my time with the oak papers was a couple of kind of philosophers, if you like, environmentalists. I mean, you're a guy, Gary Snyder, that I'm sure a number of you will know, amazing leading figure in American environmentalists. And he talked about noticing that, the individuality of an oak tree. And this was that, this had kind of been thrust on me by being introduced to the philosophy of a guy called Martin Buber, who again emphasized this idea that every single tree is an individual living being. And, it's pretty obvious actually when you think about it, but it was kind of pretty important for me when because we recognize it with these big oaks that we give names to, and we kind of go, oh yeah, that's an individual, but every single one, and that's kind of slightly mind-blowing. But once you start getting that into your consciousness, I think the way that you then treat trees is not as some sort of commodity, but you start to recognize that they have a presence. They have a presence as they are individual presence when they get big enough that we kind of recognize them. Chris's tree that he's talking about, that has a big presence because it is it's the only one of its type around, because the human world has kind of taken over a little bit. I mean, one of the stories that I heard on that first meeting that I had with the 800-year-old honeywood oak that I hadn't heard before was by this curator of trees on the Marks Hall estate, Jonathan Jukes, who told me that if I'd been on that site 70 years before, there were up to about 300 other oaks of a similar age. And unfortunately, what had happened in the late 1950s is they'd all been cut down, quite literally just for cash, for the wood that they furnished, and they were felled. And we kind of initially, I was like, oh my, that's ridiculous. Why would you do that? Now, unfortunately, 2 generations on, they're going to look back on what we're doing now, and people are going to say, my goodness, why on earth did they do that? And I think it's, one of the things is to recognize what we're doing wrong, if you like, in our relationship with trees, with the natural world. If we can recognize it now, then that kind of saves us a little bit of time. The idea of standing next to this 800-year-old oak tree on this English estate and there being 300 others around there. That was quite a kind of mind-blowing idea for me at the time, and so, there's lots of lessons that we can learn along the way, but starting up projects like this that Chris is talking about, where we actually kind of recognize the value of individual trees, that's a huge first step, isn't it?
I'd like to connect 2 things you said. One is about that oak tree being an entity, a being. It's a being. Mm-hmm. And then the image of 300 oaks being cut down. You gave us this notion of mitochondria and how trees communicate with each other. Mm-hmm. And I found myself thinking, what a terrifying communication must have been going on underground when those trees were being cut down. Yeah. Is there anything more you can tell us about how trees communicate with each other that brings it to a level that maybe we all really grasp?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this has been one of the, fascinating pieces of information that have come through. Again, scientific knowledge, is so important for us as humans in the 21st century to actually accept things as being a kind of truth. And what's come out from the largely from the forestry ecologists, such as Susan Simard, is this truth that trees do communicate through their root systems effectively, through the, as you say, the mitochondrial level on this the fingering, the kind of the fingertips of their roots, if I can put it like that, in a kind of clumsy human way. They have fungal growths, and this is fairly well documented now. And this allows trees, therefore, to pass on information to each other, along with nutrients and water. So it was best described to me by a naturalist who said, so imagine that a tree down the road or within the woodland is being attacked by caterpillars. What it can do is it passes this information on under the ground through the root system to the other trees, saying things like, raise your tannin levels. And then the other trees will be able to raise their tannin and are less likely to get attacked by these caterpillars. So this is very well documented. Susan Simard's, fantastic kind of leading figure, in this field. You can go and look at her TED lectures, and she explains it very well. But it's on this tiny, tiny kind of fungal level that trees are communicating. But as you say, the implications and the kind of metaphorical sense of what was going on in the woodland that I know down the road from me, when in the 1950s, there were these 300 oaks being cut down, just doesn't kind of bear thinking about almost. And you can talk, I looked at, as I say, I go back into the cultural history and the literary history of the way that we've described trees. You go back to Dante and you have, trees screaming. Read your Thomas Hardy poems, and he talks about the sound that trees make when they are cut down. And one of the most startling moments I had, again, during my time, was being driven by Jonathan Jukes to an area of the estate that had recently been excavated by putting pigs on, and they had eaten away at all the undergrowth. And what they'd revealed were these 4 or 5 huge footprints from the 1950s of where these ancient oaks had been cut right down to the ground. And this was just, it impacted this idea that there was this whole community, there was this whole woodland that existed here 2 generations ago. And it genuinely, I think I talked about these, these kind of ghost lands of, if you think of how many hundreds of thousands of individual insects and birds, etc., live within one tree, the scale of the devastation becomes quite powerful.
Well, we're at a point in this conversation where we need to move to the chats, but what I would like to, before turning it over to Beth, James, is there a little section that you would just like to read that you had hoped to read, or are we at a point where you go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you. So one of the things that I think I kind of learned as I went along through my time was this kind of connection, if you like, this if you want to call it a kind of natural connection. And it wasn't, as I've hopefully explained, this wasn't what I thought I was going to end up writing about when I was writing this book. But it became a really important part. So maybe I can just read, and it gives a sense of the diary aspect as well. So this is the 14th of December. The moon is a vast white orb tonight, a circle of light. I watch from the oak in the field. The moon shadow haunts the field and flickers in fragments on leaves of bramble below and on the remaining oak leaves around me. Earlier, I watched the moon as it climbed the eastern horizon. Then it was even vaster. When it first rose, it was brushed with soft hues of honeydew. Now it is paler. I will watch it as it ascends the sky, as its ashen sheen grows ever whiter. 22nd of December. A rug of frozen oak leaves lines the floor of the field. The sun rises golden on this solstice day. It is the turning time. Light gathers. Sunshine seeps back into the day. I know the world as never before. The oak is warm beneath me. I feel its skin on mine. I close my eyes and face the winter sun. Just short.
Well, thank you for that. And James and Chris, thank you for getting us inside this world. And I'd like to now ask Beth to go into the chat and see what she would like to engage you on.
Sure. Thank you, John, for those wonderful questions and entry points into the work that both of them are doing. Folks, if you all have questions, please feel free to type them in so that I can ask our guests anything that has come up. First, just a comment from Jan Blodgett, which is just that Suzanne, is it Simard? Simard,
yeah.
Whom you referenced, has a new book coming out in May, and it's called Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering How the Forest is Wired for Intelligence and Health. So if you're intrigued by that, there's another book that you can read this spring. I have a question myself, which is one for Chris first, and then one for James. Chris, I'm by no means a tree expert, but I recently learned about the absolute tragedy of the American chestnut blight. And I don't really understand beyond just knowing that within 40 years, these thriving American chestnuts, which were this central part of sort of early American life, a fungal blight just took them all out. And are they extinct? Are there any American chestnuts that we can see today in this area?
So unfortunately, I don't know of any in our area. However, there's some select kind of really small, maybe like 10 or 15 trees, small pockets of trees throughout the country that survive, that kind of somehow develop some natural resistance to this. And from that, some nurseries claim to have access to these, and they're selling like these, they claim that they're blight resistant kind of seedlings, but there is a lot of work going on, especially with the American Chestnut Foundation, to kind of develop these blight resistant trees that I think on their website, they claim to have them ready in about the next 10 years. So I think that's something that people are interested in kind of reintroducing into our environment, because they were such a big part of American kind of pioneering and things like that. But it's also really interesting that a lot of the trees around in the Carolinas that had to be cut down, their root systems are still alive. And so they'll send out kind of 20-foot seedlings that actually still are affected by the blight. So it's still very active in our area, but it's just kind of interesting to see that, the trees themselves, we perceive them as kind of dead. They're still alive underneath the ground. I always think that's really interesting to learn about.
So they're still living trees, but as soon as they grow into a tree, the blight takes the part that we can see.
Yes.
That's so fascinating, but they have this root system. So, okay. Yes. And Pam Hay from Davidson is adding that there is one on campus and at the Pines that is the result of breeding from the Chestnut Foundation. Thank you. Fascinating. James, I'm seeing you nod along. Are there chestnuts in the UK that are thriving? They're just a different version of the tree?
Yeah, there are, but we've got a similar thing, as in we've got this something called ash dieback, which is massively worrying in terms of our ash trees, which is a huge kind of factor that's taking place in Britain at the moment and across Europe actually. So this again a kind of similar narrative where as humans we're having to sort of do the best we can to step in and kind of ameliorate what's happening to certain species of trees, certain families of trees. Yeah.
James, this is a question for you from Nancy in the audience, which is, are the honeywood tree and the remaining trees at Marks Hall now protected?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, very much. It was, I mean, the Marks Hall estate is a gorgeous, if you're ever in Essex, do go and have a look at it, because it's a gorgeous little kind of little microcosm of kind of old English estate life kind of thing. And this happened a lot across Britain, across England specifically after the Second World War, that the estates were in a kind of a very bad kind of financial state. The kind of country house as such on the estate had to be pulled down because it had been used during the Second World War by troops and was in a really bad state of repair. And so, I mean, you can't kind of blame anyone on one level in that the estate was simply trying to maintain itself. And one of the assets it had were these ancient trees, if you like. But obviously now we kind of look at this and think that's appalling. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad to say that the honeywood oak is extremely well looked after. It has, I mean, one of the things that we realize now is the impact of even humans just kind of gathering beneath an ancient tree and impacting the ground and the effect this has on this root system. So now it has a lovely palisade all around it that just kind of keeps people from a distance from it, which is obviously sad in some ways. But also it's been looked after because a lot of the pine trees around it that were planted again as a kind of cash crop after the oaks were cut down, they've been kind of thinned, what's known as haloing, which is this beautiful term, which effectively allows more light, more sunlight into the honeywood oak, so that in the last 5 years or so, it's actually had a kind of lovely kind of new growth out. So it's it's 800 years old and doing very well. It's doing very well at the moment. So if you ever do come to visit, Nancy, it should be in good fine fettle for you.
James, how long can it, or do you think it will, if well protected, will it live?
Well, I mean, oaks can live, certainly they can live up to 1,000 years quite comfortably. I mean, what tends to get them is that they just get they get some sort of fungal infection or a bit of a disease, and it can weaken sections of the tree, and you might then, lose one limb, and then that opens up a whole new section for invasion by some sort of infection. This is what tends to happen. But obviously, if you have a tree that is being, very carefully kind of looked after as such, this genuinely can help trees. So yeah, hopefully we've got a couple of 100 years. So if anyone wants to visit in the next couple of 100 years, it will be there for you. It will be there for you.
That sounds like a good post COVID bucket list item.
Yeah. Very much.
Chris, John is asking, is there any way to protect in a permanent manner the treasure trees here in Davidson?
So that's not really kind of an avenue that we've discussed. I think we're more focused on starting to launch the program, but I think that's definitely something that I think the town would definitely kind of rally behind and really be interested in pursuing. I know that the town has a pretty well-written tree ordinance. So, kind of these trees in that are somewhat protected, but I think, maybe after the first kind of initial, I think, enthusiasm in conservation that this program will hopefully kind of spread throughout our town. I think then that's kind of the conversation of protecting them, because, you'll have the community be able to rally behind both DLC as well as the whole treasure tree program. But that's definitely something that we're interested in pursuing, especially personally. I really am invested. So.
Very cool. Thank you. There are a couple of links that are going up in the chat right now. One is from Ada at Main Street Books. Of course, we do have the oak papers in stock. Several of you have already purchased the book. I saw Molly holding hers up when James was reading. It's really a beautiful, as you could tell from the readings, it's really a lovely work, and I wholeheartedly recommend reading it outside if possible. Yeah. When you were describing the sort of meditative quality of being outside, I have the same experience when I'm reading a book too. I think they're linked, that the physical calming that happens. So I'm grateful that you married those two experiences together. And Katie Noble has put a link about the town's tree ordinance for those who are interested. I also wanted to just make sure you all knew that both James and Chris are open to hearing directly from you all. And so Chris's email address and phone number are in the chat if you have a tree in mind that you'd like for the Treasure Tree Project to investigate. And James, you can find the website, theoakpapers.com. Is that right? The Oak Papers?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's probably the easiest way.
Way to find him. He's also on Instagram. And I think it's at JR Canton 1. But if you just search for James Canton, there's one James Canton who pops up with a picture of the book. And that's a good clue that you're on the right track. James, I had one more question for you, which is just as a former English teacher myself, and, one who knows that our own life experiences impact sort of how we are then relating to and teaching our students. How did the writing of this particular work shape the teaching that you're doing now, and how you're working with your students now?
Yeah, that's a good question, Beth. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that in my kind of journey, if you like, when I first was going to the Honeywood Oak, as I say, I was teaching, children from kind of 12 to 18 or so. Now I'm teaching them that are kind of from 18 to sort of 80. I mean, I was doing a bit of the 18 to 80 in those days. So, I mean, I've taken school children actually to the Honeywood Oak, and we've had classes there back in the day, and that was really good. I mean, that's really good. As teaching the full-time, teaching a slightly older cohort on the MA Wild Writing. One of the kind of core parts of the master's course is field trips, and is stepping into our outdoor classroom. So even during kind of standard seminars, I will quite happily pause whatever book we're looking at, whatever discussion we're having, and fit time in to go onto the campus of the University of Essex, which we're very fortunate is a gorgeous old English estate campus, very similar to the Marks Hall estate. In fact, where John Constable, the painter, had his first commissioned painting, Wivenhoe Park, which I believe's in Washington, actually. Very much it's part of our practice. It's absolutely essential to the wild writing concept that you get out of the classroom, of the kind of human-made box, and you go out into the natural world, and you take your knowledge. You can take your books, as you so well put it, Beth, take your books, go and sit under the oak while you're reading the Oak Papers, and you find, what we find with our students is that one of the things in the feedback that they have enjoyed more than anything else is this field work aspect to the course. And of course, what it also does as humans is it bonds you. You go off together with your books and and your binoculars, and you have a field trip, you have a day out, and it's beautifully bonding. I think we realize that as humans, that when we go off into the natural world, if you like, together, funnily enough, we all enjoy it together, even if it's pouring with rain or snowing or whatever. It's a kind of communal experience. So, yeah, I think that's an important kind of learning aspect to all this. Yeah.
I can attest to that, because my first year of teaching, I was one of my co-teachers, who was the science teacher, was Ada Fitzgerald, Main Street Books owner. And wow. We went on a 7th grade camping trip overnight and have been bonded forever ever since. and now work together again. So yes, I second that.
I'm
going to turn it back over to John to close this out. This has been such a treat. Thank you all three for being here, and thanks to the audience for being here as well. Take it away, John.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you, James and Chris, for this really fine experience. I'm hoping that it's changed my life reading your book, James, and Chris, walking the byways of our community. And I can hardly wait to see these little things going up on special treasure trees. So let's say good afternoon to everyone that is in our district, and good night and sleep tight to James, who is in Essex. Thank you all. Have a good day. Bye now.
Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here.